In this lecture and the next, I want to talk about retributivism. I said it's one of the two main approaches to punishment in philosophy, and it's also, I think, one of the two main ways that people in the general public think about punishment. They probably don't use these terms, but I do think that people tend to think in broadly utilitarian or retributivist terms. And I think, members of the general public often mix the two. And I think it's good to be clear, if you're thinking about punishment, what method, what way of punishment you are using in your approach to this issue. Okay, so remember I said way back in our introductory lecture, there's two big questions, for theory of punishment. What's the point of punishment? Why punish criminals at all? And how do we figure out the appropriate punishment, right? For utilitarianism, the point of punishment is deterrence. We create the most happiness by deterring crimes, right? Because crimes create a lot of unhappiness. How do we figure out the appropriate punishment? Well, for utilitarianism, it was a sort of balancing act, right? You reach a point where more punishment gets you less and less deterrence. Depending on the crime, you have to strike a balance where it is, where more punishment isn't worth the cost you pay. The worse the crime is, the further that point's going to come, right? The more it's worth paying to prevent a few extra cases of this crime. Well then, how does a retributivist answer these questions? They are not going to take the same approach. They are not going to give the same answers as a utilitarian / consequentialist. But what will they say? Well, for the question, what's the point of punishment? The retributivist, there's more complexity than this, but the very simple answer for them, the core of their answer is to give the criminal what he deserves. If you commit certain kinds of crimes, if you harm other people in certain ways, then you deserve to be punished. It is a matter of justice, it is a matter of fairness to punish the criminal, to give him what he deserves. Well, that's the point of punishment. How do we figure out the appropriate punishment? The punishment should fit the crime. What we do to the criminal should in some way be roughly equivalent to the wrong of his crime. In some way match the wrong he does to his victim and society as a whole. We'll talk more about what both of those mean, especially the second part will get us into some difficulties, but I do just want to give us more of a sketch of what retributivism is before we get into that. So retributivism, there are other theories that are sometimes used as a support, but generally, retributivism has a Kantian foundation. It's built on Kantian grounds. Now, y'all might be saying, well, think of our problem, our issue in the first lecture. Well, how in the world can Kantianism fit with punishment, right? Punishment violates people's freedom, it seems. It certainly puts limits on freedom, even if we're just making them pay money, but especially if we're locking them up. Well, how can that fit with Kantianism's respect for people's choices? It's a real problem. I want you to just think about that for a second. Well, the key is this. Part of respecting someone as a rational being is to hold them responsible for their choices. Let me give you guys an example. I'll just tell you a little story, right? I was in First Landing, this has happened to me a lot in First Landing, but this is a particularly annoying case, right? I like to go hiking there. I like to, go running. Sometimes even go for a bike ride, right? First Landing's really nice. What's not nice about First Landing is that even though there are signs everywhere that say, keep your dog on a leash if you have a dog, people don't do this, right? What's even more frustrating is a lot of the dogs that are off leash, people have no control over, and some of them are pretty aggressive, right? So, in one case, I'm out, I'm running. This dog, no owner in sight, comes around a corner, starts running for me, growling, barking. Look, I have dogs, I know aggressive dog body language. He backs me up against a tree, is getting closer, growling. Finally, his owner comes into view. By this point, I have pepper spray out because I've had a few of these run-ins with dogs. I carry pepper spray when I'm running out in First Landing. I tell him to get his dog. I add a few other words there. You can probably guess about the dog and him. He gets all snotty. He gets his dog. Then he says, I don't like your tone, blah, blah, blah. And eventually it gets to the point, I say, well, look, if you don't get your dog away from me, I have pepper spray, and if you get close to me, it'll also work on you, buddy. He then wanders off, right? He suddenly decides this confrontation is not worth his valuable time. Now, why do I tell you this story? Well, one, don't be a jerk. Don't have your dog off a leash. And if you for some reason you do have your dog off a leash, don't let it wander 50 feet away from you, especially if your dog's aggressive. And if someone calls you on it, don't be a jerk about that, right? But I tell this story not just to underline the morals of don't let your aggressive dog wander free, but I tell it because I wasn't angry at his dog, right? I was scared of his dog. It was a pretty big dog. I don't want to get bitten. It wasn't wasn't quite German Shepherd size, but it wasn't, Chihuahua size either. I would say it was about 80% German Shepherd size, right? I don't want to get bitten by this dog, but I also don't want to spray the dog in the face, right? I don't want to hurt this dog. Why? Because the dog is not responsible, right? The dog's a dumb animal. He might be vicious, but that's not his fault, right? He's a dog. If he's vicious, it's probably because his owner's a bad owner. I don't want to hurt this dog. I would have felt really bad if I had to blast this dog with pepper spray. I feel differently about his owner. I was furious with his owner. If his owner had crossed the line and gotten an inch closer to me, I would have sprayed him in the face with pepper spray and not felt bad about it for a second. I should not admit this to you guys. And this is not noble, but there was a little part of me who was kind of sad he decided to let the issue drop, right? I'm still angry at this guy. I'm not angry at the dog. I don't want to hurt the dog. I'm furious at the owner, and part of me does want to hurt the owner, right? And I didn't do it. But why is that? I think there's something to this attitude, right? Well, the owner is responsible for his behavior in a way the dog's not. The dog's an animal. The dog behaves in the way it's trained. The owner has control over his behavior. He is a rational being. He is a person who can make choices. He's making bad, selfish, crappy choices, but he can make them, right? And being angry with this owner in a way that I'm not with his dog is a mark of the fact that I take him to be a rational being who's responsible for his actions in a way his dog is not, right? My point here is respecting someone as a rational being, treating someone as a rational being, is not just a matter of being nice to them and saying, oh, Wonderful, rational beings, aren't they precious? Shouldn't we always be nice to them, right? In some cases, when someone is a rational being and chooses to act badly, part of that recognition is being angry with them, resenting them, right? Part of that, if you're a rational being yourself and you realize your own behavior is crappy, part of that is feeling guilty, right? If you think of something lousy you did in your past when you were an adult or even a teenager, if you think about it, you'll probably feel guilty, right? On the other hand, if someone tells you something, crappy you did as a 2-year-old, one they'll never let me live down is I guess I pinched my grandfather on the bottom once. 2 years old, right? I didn't know what I was doing. My family tells this story over and over and over and over again, right? One of those things you'll never get past. Very embarrassing, especially when they tell your wife this story one of the first times they meet her, right? But anyway, it's embarrassing, but I don't feel guilty for it, right? I was a 2-year-old. I had no control. There's other things I've done, in life that I think about and I feel guilty or I feel ashamed of. Why? Because unlike that case, I had control. Holding myself to be a rational being means feeling guilt and shame in some cases. Holding others to be rational beings means being angry with them in certain ways, resenting their behavior in certain ways that it doesn't make sense to resent the behavior of a dog or a very young child, right? Or just a natural object, right? If I fall and there's a stick in the path and I fall and hit my face in the path and hurt myself, it doesn't make sense to be mad at that stick, right? I might be, but that just doesn't make sense. If someone trips me, it makes perfect sense to be angry with that person. He's not a stick. He has control over his behavior. Anyway, they make this point a lot in the Hi-Fi Nation episode. I think it's a pretty basic one, right? Respecting as a rational being means sometimes resenting people's behavior, being angry with them in a certain way. Taking yourself to be a rational being sometimes involves shame or guilt, right? Well, this all goes into punishment. Punishment stems for the retributivist as part of this idea that an important part of treating someone as a rational being is holding them responsible for their behavior. So a retributivist, digging more deeply into this, a retributivist will say punishment is supposed to show respect for both the victim and criminal as a rational being. Way back, in an earlier lecture when Luke Hunt was talking, said, we deprive people of their right to legitimate punishment. You guys might have thought, well, what's Luke Hunt thinking about? That just sounds weird. Hegel says these kind of things too, about the right to punishment. But I think what they're getting at is this idea that punishment treats the criminal as a rational being, or it should. And now look, think about it this way. If we don't, punishment itself makes a statement. Punishment says the criminal is responsible for his actions and he's done wrong to another rational being. And people like Hegel, and I think Hunt would be in this category too, will say, look, if we don't punish, or our punishment isn't set in accordance with what the criminal has done, then it makes one of two statements. Either the criminal is not responsible, he's not in fact a rational being, which even if the criminal might not like this form of respect and might prefer that we not respect him, saying that he's not a rational being, not responsible, fails to respect him. Or the other possible thing a failure to punish a crime might say is what the criminal did to the victim is acceptable. Number one fails to respect the criminal as a rational being. Number two fails to respect the victim, right? In either case, we as a society are making a statement either that the criminal's not rational or that it's okay to treat the victim like this. Either way, we fail to respect a rational being. Now think about here what the retributivist would say about punishing children in the insane. Well, we'll talk about this next lecture. What do you think they would say there? Utilitarian has a reason for not punishing children in the insane. If punishment's all about deterrence, we can't really deter them. Well, what would the retributivist say? He's not going to want to punish, or she's not going to want to punish children in insane either, but what reason would a retributivist give? One final point here, and we'll emphasize especially the first point here over and over, are the limits set by retributivism. The punishment must fit the crime. No excessive punishments, no matter what. You cannot do something to somebody that doesn't fit with their crime, even if it has good consequences. Even if forcing people into becoming informants has good consequences, well, we either seem to be punishing them too much, maybe in the case of Tiber, in another case we might be letting them off easy. Either way, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. But in some cases of excessive punishment doesn't fit the crime. Think about the case of Maryland, right? The punishment going on the chain gang for stealing, shoplifting, does that really fit the crime? Ask yourself that. We'll get more deeply into it next lecture, but ask yourself if it does. Another limit set by retributivism is that there can't be any dehumanizing punishments, even if the criminal might deserve it. Punishments have to respect human dignity. Dehumanizing punishments generally taken to be punishments that are just supposed to break the person, reduce them to a sort of level of an animal, right? Torture is sort of the definition of this. And a retributivist would say, we can't torture as a punishment, even if some criminal deserves it. Anders Breivik probably deserves to be tortured, right? But the retributivist would say, he's still a human being, he has human dignity. Torture, breaking him, subjecting him to punishments that are dehumanizing, even if he might deserve it, does not respect human dignity. There's this clause in the Constitution. You guys probably the Bill of Rights. Hopefully you guys paid attention to it when we read the Bill of Rights. Beginning of this unit, actually we won't do that till the next unit. I'm getting ahead of myself. But you will pay attention when we get to it, that says no cruel and unusual punishments, right? Well, the retributivists will say the reason we can't have cruel and unusual punishments is that they fail to respect human dignity. Even if a criminal has done something so bad he might deserve these punishments, they are dehumanizing in a way that fails to fit with human dignity. Torture is the biggest example of that. Okay, so hopefully you guys see the basic retributivist framework. We'll talk about it in more detail, finish up the unit on punishment in the next lecture.